Today in the EU, unpacking the European Commission's political guidelines. As Ursula von der Leyen strived for re-election, she offered concessions across the political spectrum. These tactical negotiations have shaped the European Commission's next mandate. But what does the manifesto really entail, and which points will VDL truly prioritize? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm here in the studio with politics reporter Magnus Lund Nielsen to analyze the proclaimed goals of the next European Commission. Hi, Magnus.
Hi, Giada.
The new political guidelines for the upcoming European Commission under VDL were released last week following her reconfirmation after last Thursday's plenary vote. What kind of document are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at a kind of election manifesto. It was very much tailored to get her past the 360 votes she needed in plenary in order to have a majority behind her.
And so when we look at the previous guidelines, the previous manifesto that was published in 2019, how is this one different?
It's different in the sense that it was almost like some, I guess, would say, remarkably boring in the way that we didn't have a flagship program as we did last time around. She had this idea of, for instance, the Green Deal. This time around, the political guidelines and her speech yesterday lacked those sort of oomph. That being said, it focuses more on less regulation. It focuses more on sort of competitiveness than it was ever on the agenda 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it tries to be sort of doing everything everywhere at once.
Yes, except for the fact that VDL is not starring in a movie by the Daniels, but she's the head of the European Commission. How is she planning to please everybody?
She's trying to sort of throw some glitter and some gifts for the political families that ended up backing her and ensuring her the 360 votes that she indeed got yesterday. So there's a little bit of housing for the socialists, a bit of the social component, and there's a little bit of climate. She talks about safeguarding the policies in the Green Deal, and there's a bit about the budget. There's a talk about like the EU needs to step up on the global stage, and then she also talks about some of the things that used to be political taboos in the EU that definitely aren't anymore.
Like what?
Yeah, health being one. I don't think anyone in their right mind 5 years ago would have talked about health or defense as Ursula von der Leyen did yesterday. So it is also reflective of the overall change of political trajectory over the last 5 years. But I should say, on a final note, I don't believe that the political guidelines that we saw yesterday is actually reflective of the also overall change of political trajectory that the EU has been on. There has been a right-wing turn, largely in the European Parliament, but certainly also in the European Council, where the member states sit. And the political guidelines that came out yesterday are hardly reflective of that.
It's interesting that you say that. However, as much as this manifesto fails to reflect the overall right-wing shift that the European Union has experienced, the Commission is planning to take a harsher approach against migration.
We should always keep in mind a member state's border is a European border. And we will do everything we can to make them stronger.
The document containing the political guidelines offers an outline of a series of ways in which this will be done. Can you give us an overview?
Yeah, so what she does say is that, well, first of all, we're going to have a tripling of Frontex staff, bringing us to 30,000 people. She announced the creation of a commissioner for the Mediterranean, which you could see as sort of reflective of how migration is now also linked to security issues and diplomatic issues. We expect that this commissioner for the Mediterranean would be in close coordination with the EU's chief diplomat, who is expected to be the Estonian, now ex-PM, Kaja Kallas.
Yes, exactly. Kaja Kallas' remit is foreign policy. So isn't it going to be an overlap between what the commissioner for the Mediterranean is supposed to do and what, Kaja Kallas has been elected to do, and why do we have this extra figure coming in?
There's different things to your question. Firstly, yes, there is some sort of overlap, but I also think, at least that's the political assessment, that there's a call for this, there's a need for this. that you need a more cohesive effort in tackling migration. So when we call it the Commissioner for the Commissioner for the Mediterranean is probably mainly going to be dealing with migration issues. And I mean, we have also with 27 commissioners, there are some overlaps already. So this is not the first time. And this would be, well, another instance of that.
Moving onwards to other points that von der Leyen tackled when it comes to migration, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
It's crucial to add that she, of course, has several pointers on migration in both the political program and the speech she gave. Our coverage has revealed that there is somewhat a disconnect between the political guidelines of Ursula von der Leyen and the communication that we see between the Commission and the member states.
How so?
In letters to member states, and we were lucky to get our hands on some of them a few days ago, they are being more explicit on what they do and what they would like to do. They are talking more directly about externalization of migrants. They are directly linking the question of migration to security issues. She didn't do that as vocally on Thursday. And so I also think that that is also telling of how the political guidelines and the speech she gave on Thursday was, well, an effort to get her past the 360 votes that she needed. I don't think it's reflective of the political reality come September. When we actually are going to have to negotiate the legislative agenda of the new commission. Because then the right-wing turn that we largely saw in the European Parliament and we've definitely seen in the European Council is going to come into its own right. That's at least my reading of it.
And the first priority of this mandate, as hinted throughout the campaign, will be competitiveness. The document reads, "There are too many structural brakes on our competitiveness." What types of brakes is von der Leyen aiming to remove?
This speaks into a more overall conversation about EU competitiveness and EU's ability to compete with other major global players, the US, China, Russia, surely. And what she's hinting at here is that she's trying to deregulate, make it easier for European companies to compete on a global market, especially on the green industry. Again, that's also a little homage to the Greens that ended up backing her.
Is Ursula von der Leyen a green candidate to be Commission President? I can tell you no. We have negotiated hard, we have made compromise. And for me, what is crucial is that the majority that holds today is a majority of pro-European democratic groups in this House. Because we need.
However, VDL is now rebranded, the Green Deal, under a different name.
And this is why I will put forward a new clean industrial deal in the first 100 days of the next mandate.
Now we find addresses to climate and climate resilience only in the final part of the political guidelines. How clean and how industrial will the deal be at the same time?
To be quite frank, it is still slightly vague what we have. We don't know what it's going to be like. She talks about this clean industrial deal. As our good colleague Donna has already covered, what we understand is that it's an effort to try and channel private investment into green industry, essentially.
Moving on to the second declared priority, defense, something new to the manifesto. In order to strengthen the European Union against Russia, von der Leyen proposed the creation of a so-called European Defense Union. That's something that Macron had already talked about. Is it an appeasement to the French leader? And how practical is this project?
Well, surely it is. It very much reflects the priorities of the French president. This is, again, also an effort to try to make it easier for member states to invest in defense industry. I mean, one thing that we should keep in mind is that this is also one of the taboos that no one would have thought of being actually on the table just 5 years ago. This is reflective of how the things that are sort of deemed acceptable within the EU political sphere has changed. Only until just 2 years ago, the idea of this kind of streamlined effort to invest in defense were completely off the tables.
And the real question is also, how will all of these programs be funded? Her speech and the document are very light on the details. What can we expect?
She tries to do everything everywhere at once with the political guidelines we've seen, and it's not completely detailed on how it's planning to pay for all that she's promising. What we do expect is that, of course, there's the current multi-financial framework, sort of the EU budget. It runs over this 7-year period. It's going to expire somewhat in the middle of the term that she's beginning here now in 2027. And negotiations have little by little already been starting. We're not entirely sure what's going to be in there, but what we know could be on the books is, for instance, she talks about finishing the capitals market, which is an effort to try to have private money to invest into EU. Or it could also be the question of own resources. Currently, we have this carbon border adjustment mechanism that essentially puts a tariff on certain goods that end up back in the EU budget. People we're talking to in the parliament expect also that to be a key ingredient in financing all of this stuff. On top of that, there's also the question of maybe more Eurobonds. This idea of common debt, shared debt between EU member states. It's not a particularly popular idea, especially with the Dutch, the Germans, and the Austrians, and also the Scandinavians typically seem to be quite reluctant. All that being said, it's still somewhat difficult to see how she will, in the end, be able to pay for all the things that she promised.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.